Guy Oil is the largest oil company in Guyana and is owned and managed by Guyanese. All the profits remain in Guyana and are used for the development of our country. So when you buy fuel and lubricants from Guy Oil, you are directly contributing to building schools, hospitals, roads, or to projects that benefit all Guyanese. Contribute to build Guyana. Buy all your fuel and lubricants from Guy Oil. Guy Oil, excellence in service.
Welcome to another edition of Disability and You. I'm Ganesh Singh. On this edition, I will be having a conversation with Yeşim Oruç, the UN Resident Coordinator to Guyana. Yeşim has been and is a champion for the rights of persons with disabilities, and she has been providing great leadership to persons, well, the disability community here in Guyana, to ensure that we are able to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, which will be our focus of discussion on this edition. Recently, we observed International Day for Persons with Disabilities, which is observed every December 3rd. This year, the day was observed under the theme, United in Action to Rescue and Achieve the Sustainable Development Goals for, with, and by persons with disabilities. Yeşim, this year, the International Day observances for persons with disabilities surrounded the SDGs, as it is commonly called. Tell us, what are the Sustainable Development Goals?
First of all, Ganesh, thank you so much for inviting me and for the kind words. And my greetings to all your audience around Guyana and in the diaspora. It's my great pleasure to join you today. The SDGs, what are they? They're a set of global goals that have been agreed to by member states of the United Nations. They're not UN goals, as everybody commonly says, but they're a set of goals that all member states, including Guyana, have agreed to, covering economic, social, and environmental targets. 17 targets that represent the world that people want to live in. It represents a future of prosperity, protecting the planet, and of economic empowerment, and making sure no one is left behind.
So it's like those broad areas that we hope to achieve to ensure that we live in a better world, one that is more sustainable, one that everyone would have an opportunity. How
Correct.
Persons with disabilities fit into this whole area of the Sustainable Development Goals?
First of all, persons with disability are recognized as a specific community in all the negotiations of the United Nations. So it's no surprise that the Sustainable Development Goals themselves included targets with respect to persons with disability. But as you were saying, as you were introducing the subject, the whole issue of with and for persons with disability, when the Sustainable Development Goals were being designed, it wasn't until the member states started consulting with organizations like yours that they were like, do we have enough targets with respect to the rights of persons with disabilities? So consequently, after all those consultations, before the member states agreed to the Sustainable Development Goals, some goals ended up including very specific targets with respect to persons with disability, especially in the social sectors, on health, on education, on employment, on the issue of inequality, on the issue of cities, urban life. So that's goal 11. And then with respect to data, which is goal 17.
And that is critical for any planning.
Of course, without data, we don't know where we are. And especially when it comes to persons with disability, as well as other communities that may be at risk of being left behind, just like the SDGs when they were being formulated. Until and unless you start counting, until and unless you start having the conversations with the representative groups, there are greater risks that national development plans and such global plans do not take into consideration the specific needs and the specific targets for the advancement of persons with disability at par with those who may not be in that.
And that's an achievement in itself to have disability mentioned, because Digressing a bit with the Millennium Development Goals, disability was not really mentioned, if mentioned at all. And, we have 1 billion people with disabilities, which is about 15% of the world population, according to the WHO. And to know that it was almost an afterthought until member states and other pressure bodies started to talk about disability, only then it was included. That statement you made is quite interesting. Yeşim, how can countries work to achieve the SDGs? As you said, it's a set of goals, it's a set of, with a number of targets and indicators to really get the world to a better place and one that is more equitable and inclusive. How can countries work to achieve these goals, and what is Ghana doing and what has been done here in Ghana over the past 7.5 years? Because that's how much we're into achieving these goals within the 15-year time frame.
Correct. Ganesh, we're at halfway point for the Sustainable Development
Definitely.
Goals. And I really appreciate this question. It's probably my favorite subject. What are countries doing? What do they do to achieve the SDGs? Again, I'd like to go back to my early point. The SDGs are not out there in some satellite for people to follow. It's really about how much countries own them. That's what we're looking at. It's countries' own national development plans. It's countries' own initiatives that will help achieve the SDGs. That is how SDGs are being approximated by ministries of education, ministries of health, ministries of social protection, ministries of labor, together with the private sector, together with civil society around the world. And in Guyana, it's no different. But let me just get on this halfway point of the SDGs. Give me 2 seconds there. At halfway point for the SDGs in year 2023, by 2030, we are very concerned that the world is off track for meeting the SDGs. The global targets on education, on getting people into schools, on making sure people have the correct health, or with respect to environmental protection, a lot of them are off track. Gender equality, off track globally. And for persons with disability, I'm a little worried, actually, the data, global statistics, this is not Guyana, global statistics show that the chances are persons with disability are even further off track from achieving the 2030 targets in all these 17 areas. So that's really where the world is with respect to this.
But Yeşim, the pandemic and some of the other disasters that the world faced, how much of a role did those factors play in putting us in this position where we can say we're off track with achieving these goals? How much of a role did those play?
A huge role, of course. The pandemic really set the world off track in human development areas by decades. So that's for sure. Recovering from the pandemic has been the biggest challenge to the SDGs. But in some other areas, including on the environmental protection areas, it's not just the pandemic. It's also countries making sure, and the part of your question was, what are countries doing to achieve it? Making sure that they're making the right policy decisions, having the right plans in place, and the budgets, and then the implementation capacities in place to achieve the SDGs. So those 3 things need to be in place. What is it? A good policy direction, strategic direction, that is your country's. It's not the UN, or nobody can tell a country like Guyana or another neighboring country, Uruguay or Brazil, say, here's what you need to do. The targets are what we've agreed on. Human rights are global principles targets. But what countries do is, here is my vision, my national development. For instance, in Guyana, the low carbon development strategy. It has the global goals, sustainable development goals at its center. That's the kind of first requirement for advancing on these global goals, is having a national policy
Policies in the specific areas.
And strategy, strategic framework.
Definitely.
The second is budgets, including, of course, the world committed to, there is a financing commitment by the developed countries towards supporting countries in development, but most importantly, it's national budgets. Using national budgets in even much poorer countries, the capacity of the state institutions and national budgets to deliver on education, health outcomes, on social protection, on protection of the environment, etc., is of course unparalleled. But above all, of course, keeping growth levels is really, really important, making sure that countries have the right policy environment for maintaining growth. That's the primary requirement for achieving, of course, development. But keeping national budgets on target, on focus is the other. And the third point, as I was mentioning earlier, is really making sure that at the local level, the partnerships and implementation capacities are in place.
Mm-hmm. And, one of the things that some countries might say, especially the poor developing countries, is that we are dependent on donor agency funding from multilateral financial agencies and the developed countries. That dictates how much we can be able to achieve. Do you think enough is being done by those three categories of funding entities that I mentioned to help small states, developing states like Guyana, to achieve their goals or their targets?
So Guyanese authorities right now are at the COP, right? The Convention of the Parties on Climate Change. There, the whole issue is on financing for climate change, and climate action is one of the Sustainable Development Goals, of course. Has the global development community met its financing for development targets? If that's your question, the answer is a big no. The targets have not been met, and especially small island developing states are really clamoring for making sure that the climate investments are made and that the resources are put there, funded by an understanding of our shared but differentiated responsibility towards financing climate action and especially adaptation funding. In addition, of course, right now in climate action, in Dubai, the world leaders are discussing on how to finance a loss and damage fund. But I don't want to go off track just to financing for development. It's also national actions that really, really matter. And especially in Guyana's growth context. In addition to having a very good strategic framework, which is a low carbon development strategy with global goals, having the budgetary discipline and the reporting mechanisms around the SDGs are essential. And we've been really quite impressed with how Guyana has used its own mechanisms, its budgeting processes to, one, integrate sustainable development goals in national processes, and two, to make allocations for those sectors where achievements need to be accelerated. Namely, of course, I'm like a broken record: education, health, and social
Those
protection.
are some priority areas,
Well, they also happen to be the areas where we have the greatest risk of persons with disability falling behind.
And the areas that they fell behind before.
Exactly, in areas where they have fallen behind before. For instance, when it comes to poverty, we know that persons with disability are at much greater risk of experiencing poverty compared to those who are who don't have certain disabilities. When it comes to access to education, we know globally persons with disability are much more likely, I think twice as likely, to report worse health status compared to those without. Similarly with education. So those are areas we know, and those are enabling areas. Those are the areas that will enable the people of Guyana, people of the world, to take advantage of all the other development opportunities we have. So it's really important to make those investments. And we've been, the government of Guyana takes its sustainable development goals commitments very seriously. Similarly, it takes its human rights commitments very seriously. And the reporting on the advancement on the SDGs has been quite remarkable.
And Yeşim, some priorities that you mentioned: education, social services. Are there any others to add as it relates to persons with disabilities and how they can better be included in the whole frame of trying to achieve these goals in Guyana?
Of course. First of all, the whole area of, again, in the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goal number 16 is about governance and rule of law. You started that out saying very clearly and we talked about this, how SDGs became inclusive of the rights of persons with disability only through voice and consultations. Making sure that persons with disability, their organizations, are in the rooms where the discussions happen, where policy decisions get made, where budget decisions get made. This is really, really, really important. It's about good governance. So that's really one thing we know has to be addressed around the world, where the persons with disability get to become part of and are inclusively part of the process. That processes are inclusive of everyone, including persons with disability. Maybe that's a better way to put it.
In a meaningful way, including them in a meaningful way.
Correct.
And it's so, it goes back to the theme, which is united in action to rescue and achieve the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, for, with, and by persons with disabilities. And you've been doing a lot. The UN system here in Guyana would have been doing a lot, working with the disability community over the years to, again, champion the rights of this marginalized group and to ensure that they're included and we can have a more equitable society. Tell us a bit. I'll allow you to just share with us some of the work that you and the UN system, the various agencies, would have been doing over the years with the disability community here in Guyana.
And thank you, Ganesh, for that. Firstly, the UN, we have our own internal strategy. It's called our Disability Inclusion Strategy. And it applies to the work of all UN agencies, including myself, on how I communicate, on how we organize our own funding, how we organize our own programs, how we organize our own recruitment. So we do have a disability inclusion strategy, and we haven't left it at just trying to implement the strategy. We actually benefited very much from what I call your tough love. We have asked you and your membership to hold us to the scrutiny of our own targets, of our own standards, and say, my UN friends, we ask you to tell your UN friends whether we are keeping in line with our own strategy. And at the end of last year, I remember on World Disability Day 2022, we were having a discussion, and we were, our glass is not as full as we thought it was. We noticed that our own communication products, for instance, were not as accessible as we thought they were. So we've invested in that. We have seen that our use of indicators and targets in our own programs were not in some cases persons with disability were not visible in our indicators and targets. And I thank you for giving us that it's sometimes painful to get these criticisms, but it was very useful for us to make sure that we align to our own disability inclusion strategy. I think our big, what I was most proud of is that we formalized our consultation with you and with community of persons with disability for our own UN processes. So formalizing consultations, making sure that the voice of persons with disability are around the table. Another one has been also that we work with you. We don't assume that persons with disability are included in any work. Recently, for instance, we were working on migrant populations, and we were doing an assessment in one of the regions in the hinterland with our Ministry of Foreign Affairs and other government partners. We're like, somebody's missing at this table when we designed our assessment mission. And because we have a formal engagement, we were able to include you and other people to come with us down to Lethem to visit certain sites together to do a joint assessment. So we were together in all of these things. And we were also very proud to be able to ensure, nominate, and support the participation of the Guyana Council of Persons with Disability in multiple international fora. including recently on the SDG forum in Santiago, and many others where you, I believe, joined government national delegations as well. But that's the idea, really, to make sure that we, as the UN agencies, formalize our relationship. Of course, at the programmatic level, so that I was talking about internally, at the programmatic level, I've been very pleased and proud to see that under Spotlight Initiative, our big flagship program to end gender-based violence, and we're now during the 16 days of activism, there's been dedicated attention and engagement with also on the risks that people with disability have with respect to gender-based violence, and to address that common concern. And I've also been very proud to note that among the UN agencies, we talked a lot about education in this program. That the
UNICEF.
Correct, of course. UNICEF has been working very closely with the Ministry of Education to support better inclusion in that ministry's programs as well.
So it's a holistic approach across programmatic areas and also internally.
Correct.
To better include persons with disabilities. And I'm sure that leadership, that inclusion will transition into the work that you do with other stakeholders here in Guyana for them to better include persons with disabilities.
We hope so too. Of course, one should never take things for granted.
Yes.
So using data and targets to make sure we use our scorecards, data, and targets is really important, and that's probably one of my most important recommendations to all policymakers, to all my UN agency colleagues, other development agencies. Unless we make persons with disability visible in our data, in the way we count, in the way we monitor our own work, we will never be able to say, yeah, we've done a good job. So we should really be making sure that we use data disaggregated from social protection to education to health to environmental protection to food systems. How many persons with disability are benefiting, are going to be part of Guyana's amazing food system transformation? Really, unless we start measuring and putting targets, we will never be 100% sure that
these persons are included.
Exactly.
Yeşim, I want to thank you very much for sharing with us as we observe International Day for Persons with Disabilities and we pivot to rescue the SDGs. I thank you also for your leadership and supporting the work of the disability community here in Guyana.
Thank you, Ganesh, for the opportunity to join you and your audience today.
Thank you very much. And this was another edition of Disability and You. I encourage you to join me next time as we share information from the disability community. Thank you.
Thank you.